a number of years ago, I did a study on the Shroud of Turin and to see if it's actually authentic or not. And this article that I'm about ready to show you is from Patterns of Evidence. And one of the things about it is that they're talking about some new evidence that seems to point to the fact that it's probably dated to about 2,000 years ago, instead of the previous 1300s, whatever it was. Now, this is controversial in the world of Christianity, number one. Number two, even the world of science. I think this whole straw turn issue is interesting. Is it really the cloth of Jesus? Personally, I would say yes, myself. I'm on the side that I think it is, but some people do not think this way. Now, I want to just, before I jump into this article about this new X-ray test that seem to suggest that the Shroud of Turin is from the time of Jesus. Before I talk about that, I want to talk about one objection that I keep hearing, and it's a really strange one to me because it doesn't really make sense. The objection that I keep hearing people make is something to the effect of, why would God, first up, the person usually sets it up like, I do not think the Shroud of Turin is real. I mean, I don't think it's authentically Jesus' burial cloth. And then they say something to the effect of like, oh, okay, if God is really God, why would he preserve a relic like this that we as humans could worship? And I just think this is a horrible argument. So if you're to make that argument down below, I encourage you not to, because it doesn't structurally make sense at all. God makes a lot of stuff all through history. Like, let's say in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. People worship heaven and earth. People created animals. People worship animals. God created humans. People worship humans. I could go on and on. God makes a lot of things, and people worship those things. For example, in the Bible, Moses was commanded by God to create this bronze serpent where the people were supposed to look to the bronze serpent to be healed. Well, as the years went by, the Hebrews decided to worship this bronze serpent, and the religious Jewish leaders had eventually crush the serpent, break it down, and remove it because it is being worshipped by the Jewish people. So just because God created something, and just because God allows something to exist or come into being or commanded something to come into being by people, doesn't make that thing, does not speak to the fact that God would have not allowed it to. It doesn't follow. Uh, the problem is not so much that we don't have. The problem is not so much that God would not have done it. The problem is that we actually have things from 2,000 years ago in the ground that we dig up, whether it's old manuscripts to old artifacts that are from the time of Jesus or the time of the apostles or the time of pre-Jesus or the time of David or whatever. We find these artifacts in the soil. Why would God allow that when we could be worshiping those types of things? So this argument is a horrible argument. So please don't make that. But I do think it is the Shroud of Turin. Myself, I did research on this. I did a lot of studying on this. And it's like, yeah, it really does look like the burial cloth of Christ. Now, this is not slam dunk evidence that I'm going to give you here for the burial cloth of Jesus, but I think it does provide another line of evidence why it was during the time of Jesus that this was created. Not only woven during the time of Jesus, but also it does seem to have some very unique and peculiar attributes to the cloth, especially if you start researching it, especially the 3D image and things like that in the cloth. All right, let's jump into the article here. Let me bring it right in here. So this Patterns of Evidence released this article a month or two ago in November and talks about some of the latest research that has been done on it. So let me just go through it here quickly with you. And I'm not going to go through every single word. You can read it yourself. I'll try to link to the article down below if you want to check it out. These new scientific methods for centuries of Shroud of Turin, it says here, has been captivated minds of people, both skeptics and the faithful. Many believe it really is, and many people do not believe it is. The Shroud of Jesus, as I just said before, it talks about the size of it, 14 foot long, 3.5 foot wide, etc. And it has been well researched. Recently, they did this study with this wide angle X-ray scattering, wax, if you want to call it that way, and it talks about how that they compared it to other types of cloth during the time period of that day and age, and it looks very much like the different types of cloth during the Mossad siege in Israel in the 55 and 74, around that era. So this would be very similar to the same types of cloth that we see in Masada, which would be in the same culture and the same types of material that would be made. Now, it gets into some of the history of it, previous dating discrepancies. Sometimes some things do look older, some things in the 70s. There's a lot of scientists, the STRP scientific research group that went and studied Shroud. If you want to learn more about this, there's some amazing documentaries on YouTube that you can go watch that talk about this whole thing, which is quite crazy, pretty cool if you ever get interested in looking at that. But in 88, there was a lab test on it that seemed to had carbon dated back to like the 1300s. And if this is the case, then it looks like it might be created by that. But the counter argument to this is, as this points out, is that it does seem that the material that was used though for this carbon dating seems to be a slightly different type of material, more cotton instead of linen, which is really interesting. The weave, what some people have hypothesized is that there was some sort of hidden weave between the new patch and the old linen cloth. So it was patched potentially, and then when they did this test, they found the weaved in new cloth, the little piece. So when the analysis was done, that's the reason why it comes out to be in the 1300s, around the 1300s. It's kind of when in the 1300s was when the cloth kind of came to the West, became known in the West. Now, there is evidence that there is a shroud that was, if I remember right, I'm pulling this from memory now, that there was other locations where the shroud was said to be the Shroud of Christ. And it was stored at another location, and it disappeared. And a few years later, a shroud showed up in the West. And people claimed it was the Shroud of Jesus. So quite interesting. And you can learn more about that as you study it yourself if you want. When it goes into the details of this whole how they measure it, I'll just read it here. Wide angle X-ray scattering, the new advanced method applied to the ancient fabric, penetrates deep into the material to analyze it at a microscopic level and measure the deterioration of the linen threads. It's a sort of radiography similar to the type of scan that you would do on a bone to see if there is fracture. Over time, the structure of the material degrades. We can tell from that how much time has passed and therefore the date of the object. This is quite interesting. Working with minuscule fragments of relic, this guy and his team confidently dated the material to about 2,000 years ago, suggesting that an individual lived during the era of Jesus. This limits the scope of who this shroud could have came from if it's during the time of Jesus. Now, there's thousands of people living in the Middle East at that time, so potentially it could be, someone else, but it does limit it to a very specific time and tight time and history to the time of Jesus. Because the X-ray scattering technique is non-destructive, the same sample could be tested by labs around the world, helping to confirm the findings. Moreover, other data methods agree in the assessment that the shroud to the 1st century AD. There's another study that seemed to point to this as well. The ancient fabric found in tombs, which preserved from environmental contamination, showed evidence that X-ray and carbon-14 dating agree well. Okay. Also, it points out, which if you actually watch some of these documentaries, which are kind of cool, as I said before, they do talk about how that people did try to replicate the shroud, and it's pretty hard to, because we're talking about not just blood, but we're talking about human blood, and a specific type of AB plus human blood. And we know that it's rare, and it is commonly found in the Middle East, which kind of supports that it possibly is from the Middle East, especially during 2,000 years ago. So it's another line of evidence pointing to that. It also talks about how that this blood has different levels of different types of chemicals, which seem to bring evidence to the fact that there was some sort of trauma involved. There was pollen in there. There was it definitely looks like a image of a crucified man in the image on the shroud. They've done all sorts of research on this, and also I think that let's see here. Anything else here that seems to be of interest? You can read through this article as well, which I'll link down below. But I think that covers most of the areas I really want to cover. I think overall, again, this is just one more line of thinking where I think that the shroud really is the burial cloth of Jesus. Now, again, you might disagree with me. That's fine. But I think there's so many lines of evidence now pointing to it, and only one main one that seems to be against it, and that's the carbon dating. But even that has been cast into doubt over the last 20, 25 years now. since the early 2000s, people have been raising questions about that study, that carbon dating, saying, hey, it really does seem it came from a part of the shroud that it could have been totally different type of material. So I think overall, it does really point to Jesus's burial cloth as so many lines of evidence. Tell me what you think below.